Well, thanks, Olga, for your kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you all and an honor to be invited to Keynote here at Learning at Scale. And I want to thank the Copenhagen team especially for hosting us all so wonderfully. As the title says, I'll be sharing some of our work at UTS on how we cultivate trust in our platforms, which scale personalized feedback to students in different ways. That trust is key to sustained effective use. That's a socio-technical ecosystem at organizational scale, but as I signal in my abstract, right now I'm also thinking a lot about the much larger scale planetary ecosystem, since trust and sustainability are clearly critical challenges for society. I'd like to explore the question of whether the climate emergency we now confront should be shaping how we think about our own work. I'll share some work in progress which draws on thinkers whom I'm finding compelling as a way to think about the future of education. That may then have potential implications for the choices we make in our work on scaling that learning with technology. That for me is an interesting question, and I want to share my current thinking with you about that to see what your thoughts might be. So this will be a little different from the typical Learning at Scale keynote, perhaps, but I hope I'll leave you with at least one provocative idea worth further thought, and I really welcome the chance to discuss this with you through the conference and after. Three headlines from BBC News from this week, right? It's all happening right now in the Northern Hemisphere with summer. And I don't know how you feel about what's going on. From optimistic, we will sort this out, we always do, to pessimistic. It can be completely overwhelming. So much information, so much debate. It's so big. Right? Our minds did not evolve to handle this level of complexity. We have never in our history, our short history on this planet, had the ability to actually hold the planet's future in our hands. That was not something that we've ever had the power to do. Okay, but it seems clear, unless you want to contest some of the science around this, you know, the unbridled growth on a finite planet just doesn't compute. All right, and yet we seem paralyzed as human beings. And I'm not for a moment going to say that there are any simple answers. Of course, that would just be ridiculous. But I am interested in asking what is the role of education in all of this, and by extension, what is our role as a community who specialize in education and how to advance that. So whether you think that we're in a terminal state, and you could be forgiven for worrying that, or whether this is something we will resolve, but we're really not sure how, the situation is grave. Okay. A diagnosis of this, I suggest, a plausible diagnosis at the moment is whether it's a diagnosis of our current condition that we will heal, or whether it's a terminal diagnosis, is that humanity is suffering from a failure to learn. What are we failing to learn? To live within our planetary limits. We're failing to understand our complex interdependence with the natural world. We're failing to master technology to enable, not undermine, civic society. We're failing to control our cognitive biases. We're failing to mature out of our selfishness. We're failing to educate the next generation on how to break out of this cycle. And we're failing to cultivate the leaders and at least get them elected who can act on all of the above in time. And I could go on. So I put it to you that we have a failure to learn at very large scale. And here we are at the Learning at Scale conference. So maybe we should have something to say about this. Okay, so here's the next question, right? Should our work change in any way to reflect the current crisis? And I think there are at least two legitimate answers. No. All education is important. EdTech advances education when it's done well. Learning at scale helps do that well. Keep going, carry on. Why would what's going on out there, other than when you watch the news and worry about what's going to happen to you or your children or your grandchildren, if you ever have them. But we just have to get on and do our stuff, right? We've got research to do, educational theories, technologies with promising affordances. Let's just do what we do and carry on. And I think that's a legitimate response, right? But there's potentially another answer, which is, yes, we're in an emergency of some sort here. And in an emergency, not all actions are equal. Some things are more strategic to do than others. Okay, so I'm giving you the solution. Yes and no. And you all work in very different contexts. So I'm not here to tell you, you need to change your research trajectory or anything. We're all operating under multiple constraints, but we may have choices we can make. I want to do some thought experiments with you, which might get you asking some new questions. Well, okay, how could we articulate the ways in which our work might change as a result, if you wanted to explore that? Well, nothing very revolutionary to say here, but we could think about knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that are particularly important for our times. We could think about the skills that people are going to need to work with each other, to work across disciplinary boundaries. And we could think about dispositions, which is less about mastery of curriculum, mastery of analytical skills, mastery of interpersonal skills even, right? But dispositions, and I want to unpack a little bit about what we mean by that. Well, let's go back to John Dewey. What do we mean? He said, knowledge of methods alone will not suffice. There must be the desire, the will to employ them. This desire is an affair of personal disposition. You may have very smart students, but they can't be bothered. You may have not academically such strong students, but they've got a curiosity and a desire to learn. We'll come to some other definitions. Here's Lillian Katz. A disposition is a tendency to exhibit frequently, consciously, and voluntarily a pattern of behavior directed to a broad goal. One of the most important dispositions to be listed is the disposition to go on learning. Any educational approach that undermines that is miseducation, right? And the tragedy is that right now in many of our schools, we're actually switching children off from learning. That's a tragedy. And finally, colleagues of mine, Ruth Deacon-Crick and Chris Goldspink, one of the key issues emerging from these findings was the learner's orientation towards the unknown, uncertainty, and ambiguity, probably the only things that we're guaranteed to know is coming at us, and their tendency to either retreat from it or move into it. The former effectively precludes deep learning, the latter is the beginning for it. So you get a sense of what people are talking about in terms of dispositions in the educational field. There's all of these references you can follow up. Of course, I'll make my slides available afterwards. Okay, so we might think, you might make a choice that you could work to support many educators, but you might want to choose educators who you believe are working on knowledge and skills and dispositions that are going to be particularly strategic for the next generation who are inheriting the mess we've created. Okay, I'm not going to prescribe what that might be. There are many routes to that, and I'm certainly not saying that's STEM and it rules out the arts and humanities for a moment. Okay, all right. I want to introduce you to two quite deep diagnoses of why we seem to be locked into dysfunctional cycles, why we seem to be paralyzed as a society. One of them is Ian McGilchrist. Anybody heard of Ian McGilchrist? We've got a couple of hands up here. That's nice. And Henry Giroux at McMaster University in Canada. Bit more recognition. Okay, all right. So for not much though. So let me introduce you to these two thinkers, who I am still getting to grips with, but I'm finding very compelling, and they're helping me think through some of these issues. Okay, diagnosis number one. Ian McGilchrist is a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, a literary scholar, used to be an academic at Cambridge teaching literature, and a psychiatrist. Extraordinary guy. In brief, he demonstrates that neuropsychology now provides robust evidence, and then he talks into philosophy and physics and art and social sciences and more, that a relation-centric, process-oriented, context-sensitive disposition to the world, and I'll explain what these words mean, should be in charge of our more abstracting analytical models and technologies. Okay, and let me explain a little bit more about that. So this book is making a lot of waves at the moment. The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. It's a 2-volume epic. It took him 10 years to write, and it's rightly attracting a lot of attention. One line from that, which I find striking: how we attend to the world is a profoundly moral act. So the things that we attend to then shapes the ways we react to the world, which then recreates that world again. Okay. And we're going to be, attention and dispositions are really closely related concepts here. So let's start with a little bit of anatomy. This is where we start with the neuroscience. Okay, why is the brain asymmetric? It's asymmetric in both structure and function. These are just photos from the book. Why? The power of the brain exists through making connections. Okay, we all get that. So the reach of that power depends on the number of connections. So why is the brain split down the middle? Why would that be an optimal architecture for maximizing connections? How do those two hemispheres talk? Through the corpus callosum. Why is it that through evolution it gets smaller? And why is it that it has an inhibitory function? It's not just a broadband connection between the left and the right. It's inhibiting activity between the left and the right hemisphere. So some basic anatomical questions, and these are, the neuroscience here is compelling. I'm not a neuroscientist, but his colleagues are saying this is one of the best accounts of what we now understand about neuroscience. So the hemispheric specialization hypothesis goes like this. It's no accident that across history and civilizations and cultures, 2 different ways of attending to the world are in recurring tension. And he says it's basically our brain's operating system, right? While both brain hemispheres are involved in pretty much everything we do, they attend to the world very differently. And just in case you're worrying, we're not talking about pop psychology and management snake oil that goes, oh, the left brain's the logical, reliable one, and the right brain is the creative, but unreliable one. He's spending a lot of time debunking that sort of pop version of the neuroscience. In fact, he argues compellingly that the right brain is the reliable one if you want to understand what's going on in the world. So again, we're talking about 2 volumes of work, but a compressed paragraph here from his work gives you a sense. So when you study brain damaged patients and somebody can only see the world through the left hemisphere, it's a very strange world. Static, isolated, fragmentary elements that can be manipulated easily, or they believe can be manipulated easily. They are decontextualized, abstracted, detached, disembodied, mechanical. They see the world in a very mechanistic way. People aren't people. People are like machines or automatons. Relatively uncomplicated by issues of beauty and morality, untroubled by the complexity of empathy, emotion, and human significance. It's an inanimate universe and a bureaucrat's dream. I love that. There is an excess of confidence and a lack of insight. So for those of us working in data analytics and AI, for those of us seeing, ridiculous metricization and KPIs within the research world, and obviously every other sector out there, the cautionary note here around hubris, around our confidence in our models, which are, of course, gross simplifications of the glorious complexity and reality of the world. Okay, if you have lost your left hemisphere, how does the world look? All is flowing and changing, provisional and complexly interconnected with everything else. Nothing is ever static, detached from our awareness of it, or disembodied. Everything needs to be understood in context, where if it's not to be denatured, it must remain implicit. So things can remain implicit and still deeply meaningful. It doesn't have to be put into language. Wholes are different from the sum of the parts, and beauty and morality, along with empathy and emotional depth, help us to intuit meaning that lies beyond the banality of the familiar and everyday. It's an animate universe, and it's a bureaucrat's nightmare. Okay. 2 very different worlds. If you're going to have a stroke, lose your left hemisphere, because if you lose your right hemisphere, you just cannot join up reality, and it takes on a very strange a detached kind of feel. Okay, now, obviously, we need both ways of looking at the world. But McGilchrist argues quite compellingly, the right hemisphere, the holistic, contextual way of seeing the world, has to be the master. The analytical, abstracting, how can I control and manipulate the world, that really evolved out of hunting. Right? When you're hunting something, you've got to zero in on it, eliminate all of the distractions, very black and white. That should be the servant to the holistic, more empathic, relational way of attending to the world. The problem is when the left hemisphere's reductionist, materialist worldview takes over, we start to see and create a very distorted world. And to cut a long story short, that is his diagnosis of a lot of the debates in philosophy and art and literature, as well as, of course, what's going wrong at the moment in the world when we start to treat each other and the planet as disposable resources. He argues, he calls for a restoration of intuition and imagination as ways of seeing the world along with science and reason. He calls for us to reforge relationships with each other, with nature, and with the sacred. And we're not talking here about, believing in a particular version of God or a particular religion. You can interpret that in many ways, but the sense of awe that there is an intelligible universe out there, many of us have experienced some sense that there is more than that. But put that to one side if you don't want to go there. Let's just reforge relationships with each other and with nature, which have, we've lost so much in Western society. And intriguingly, this is a book which is also going to talk about indigenous knowledge systems, because it turns out First Nations and indigenous people understood a lot about this. He has some fascinating examples from ancient cultures where they have myths and stories that essentially echo what we now understand from neuroscience about the left and the right hemispheres' ways of attending to the world and the battle between them. And I'm just going to mention Tyson Yonke-Porter's amazing book, Sand Talk. He's an indigenous scholar here in Australia, also an academic in RMIT in Melbourne. Angie Abdullah and others around the world are now starting to talk about indigenous AI protocols. Really fascinating stuff about how these worldviews can come together. Okay, so that's Ian McGilchrist. Diagnosis number 2 from Henry Giroux. Henry Giroux is one of the leading academics talking about critical pedagogy. Education is increasingly so infused by market forces, he would say, that our educators and students are losing the ability to fight for a more just society. The critical consciousness is going from education, from university. We're now so focused on creating graduates who have the knowledge and skills to feed the machine out there that is creating the mess we're in. They're losing that critical consciousness to actually challenge society. Just in his latest book, Pedagogy of Resistance Against Manufactured Ignorance, it's a broadside against particularly what's going on in the US around what he calls the manufacturing of ignorance, almost as a quality to be celebrated rather than to think deeply. He argues it's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously ongoing attempts to make education a fundamental element of politics. At stake here is the notion that education is a social concept, one rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, this is an education that encourages human agency, one that enables people to be both critical thinkers and committed individuals and social agents. This is a pedagogy that calls us beyond ourselves, engages the ethical imperative to care for others, to dismantle structures of domination, to become subjects rather than objects of history, politics, and power. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it's crucial for educators and others to remember Freire's ongoing project of radical literacy. He studied with and was mentored by Paulo Freire. So you will recognize that. Okay. So these are obviously, big questions about what is the purpose of education. Obviously a good question for us to be asking ourselves, because we are turbocharging different kinds of teaching and learning. Are those models of teaching and learning that advance an agenda like this, if you would subscribe to that? So we've got McGilchrist and Giroux. I'm finding them, very engaging reading. I think they're converging. It's because what Giroux is doing is documenting the havoc that right-wing neoliberal extremism, which from McGilchrist's perspective, any form of extremism is the left hemisphere kind of gone crazy, right? Everything's black and white. You push everything to the nth degree. You dehumanize in the process, right? So that the havoc that mindset is now wreaking on democracy and education, that is what critical pedagogy is all about. They're both calling for resistance. Critical modes of attending to the world, which reaffirm hope and purpose. So, things are bleak, but they are unrelentingly hopeful. And McGilchrist, they both have things to say about technology. So McGilchrist was the keynote at the AI World Summit in Amsterdam last year. So while technology clearly is a problem, it's turbocharging distorted visions of how technology can be used to manipulate and dehumanize and administer disinformation and all the rest of it, right? He would ask us, can we scale AI that actually integrates all four ways of knowing? Can we scale AI in a way that trusts people with greater agency rather than metricizing them and turning them into second-hand robots? Can we use AI that reconnects us again to the things that make us human, each other and nature, and a sense of awe about the cosmos? And Giroux, writing to me, said, well, here's three questions, Simon. How do our AI visions for the future of education relate to the obligations of democracy? As far as he's concerned, education cannot be divorced from democracy. As Dewey said, no educated citizenship, no democracy. How can our platforms be used to combat learned helplessness in the age of disinformation machines? We've now got generative AI pumping out stuff. It's just turbocharging the whole disinformation operations. And how do we imagine a future in which AI becomes a fundamental tool for expanding creative, socially responsible agency? So these people are not against technology or AI or analytics, but we're after a right hemisphere balanced use of these tools for society and obviously for art, as far as we're concerned, for education and for teaching and learning. Okay, so I offer you those two just as provocations and commend you to take a look at their work. If we agree that at least in part, the diagnosis is that we have a failure to learn at scale, do these framings provide any clues for us about how the choices that we might make about our work? So I'm now going to get into the specifics of the work we're doing at UTS and how these framings are helping me think about what I'm doing. And I hope that perhaps some of these will resonate with you. So the first way that we might think about our response is how we engage with stakeholders within our universities or within whatever your community is. One of the passions I have coming from an HCI background is to bring all that we know about human-centered, participatory co-design into the way that we conceive and design and deploy and evaluate learning platforms and analytics and AI-driven tools. And I'm going to talk about democratic methods of engaging with our stakeholders. And then obviously we can think about the particular tools and technologies we're building, what their affordances are, the values that are permeating those platforms and the social systems that are obviously must be constructed around those platforms for them to be used effectively. All right, so first of all, let me tell you a bit about deliberative democracy as a way of cultivating trust amongst students and staff. Deliberative democracy has emerged as a response in politics to the manifest failings of our current democratic systems. And there are well-articulated principles and methods for conducting a deliberative democracy consultation. You don't just get a bunch of people together who show up and talk. It's a far more facilitated, structured process. So this is from work that was started during lockdown at the end of 21. We wanted to bring together students and staff, the staff including both academics as well as casual tutors who actually do a lot of the frontline work with the students, of course, to talk about EdTech ethics. We were rolling out more analytics-enabled technology increasingly, and we wanted to take the temperature and communicate what we're doing and get their views. So in deliberative democracy, you recruit a mini public This is a very carefully designed stratified sampling of your community to ensure the right mix of diversity there. Gender, ethnic background, English as a first, second language, discipline, and a number of other variables. These people are not just coming to a brainstorming workshop. They are committing to learning from experts about the complexity of the matter at hand. They are committed to reflective, respectful deliberation. A series of workshops. This was during lockdown, so these were on Zoom, expertly facilitated by a professional. So, you can imagine 4 hours on Zoom could be a killer, but these were actually very dynamic, very engaging, lots of hands-on exercises to think about different ethical dilemmas and so forth. And their goal, there's always a deliverable in a deliberative democracy consultation, to come out with a set of draft principles to govern the use of this technology at the university, which they then presented to the senior leadership. The senior leadership must be sponsoring this. People need to know they're not just wasting their time in a talking shop. And on the link on that slide, you can watch a clip from the final presentation, and you'll get a sense of the passion and ownership that these people had developed over 5 weeks around their work, entrusting it to the university leadership, saying, don't drop the ball on this. This is serious. We care about this. There's the report. You can have a look at that. What I'm happy to say is that just last month, UTS published its AI operations policy, declaring its ethical principles for the way we're going to deploy AI in the university. And I think we may be one of the first universities to put that out there. So carrying that stuff through. In May, I was running similar workshops with students around generative AI and with predictive modeling. Again, explaining to them what these things are and trying to elicit their views in order to help us make decisions. Should we do predictive modeling of student outcomes? What are your concerns about that? Should we turn it on to try and detect AI writing? This is how good it is at the moment. These are the claims they're making. What do you think? And so forth. So students find this deeply rewarding, and it's really is building their agency and the sense that they can make a difference, as well as informing us. Okay, and another aspect of building the trust at UTS is around what I call conversations in 4 different rooms in the university: the boardroom, the staff room, the server room, and the classroom. And I could speak at length about this, but I have written this down now into a chapter, actually, in the book that Olga Viberg has edited, Practicable Learning Analytics. And there's a long webinar about this. But essentially, we're talking about the fact that to deploy these platforms at scale within your institution, you're going to have conversations and know how to have conversations with the different kinds of stakeholders in these forums, right? From aligning what you're doing with the university strategy, talking about the outcomes, securing the funding, etc. If you don't get to the staff room, build the rapport and trust with the academics, nothing's going to happen, because we're not going to force anyone to use these tools. I'll show you some of these tools in a little bit. But we don't get to deploy if an academic doesn't trust us enough to put this with their students. For real. We're not doing experiments. These are real students paying real fees with real staff. Obviously, when you go beyond a research prototype to want to scale something to be part of the 24/7 infrastructure at the university, you're going to talk to your IT people. You have to have very good relationships with them. You need to go through solution architecture design, security, single sign-on, all of that boring stuff that you don't worry about as researchers when you're just trying to prove a concept. But this is going to be on 24/7. This is a student-facing system. They're not used to people in the university running student-facing 24/7 learning environments. That's what the products out there do that they buy. But we are now as a center developing these because there are no products that do these yet. And then finally, the classroom. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we actually study what happens when the students come face to face with these different platforms, which are giving them automated feedback. And that's the research that we publish. Okay, so deliberative democracy and conversations to build trust as 2 different answers to that question of how you build trust. And it's those foundations that underpin the continued sustained use of our tools within UTS. And I need to be clear, we haven't cracked this. It's not like every course is using our tools or anything. We still work with the early adopters, but we're now at that interesting phase where their more cautious colleagues are seeing what they're doing and going, oh, okay, I respect you as an academic. I'd like to see that happening in my course, and then they come knocking on the door. So we're in that sort of second phase of work now. After 9 years at UTS, I've been there. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about before we close are the educational affordances of these platforms. If we wanted to build learning analytics and AI ed and learning at scale platforms that responded to some of those challenges and those values that McGilchrist and Giroux are calling for, well, what might that look like? So I've been sort of interrogating my own work, and I'll give you a worked example of how I'm working on this, which might help you think this through. So at the moment, we're developing, right at the early days, this concept of what we're calling belonging analytics. And we've literally just yesterday published a paper in the new Learning Letters open access journal, which you might want to take a look at, learningletters.org, to disseminate very rapidly peer-reviewed findings to the community around learning and analytics and AI. So you can follow those links. Can we conceive of these platforms that would foreground, for example, student sense of belonging? Why are we interested in belonging? Because we are interested in the emancipatory value of education that opens horizons, that helps people see in new ways, that makes an environment that, even though we have social injustices in the past, we want to bring in more people who perhaps have not had those opportunities before. Storytelling, stories, not a new idea. Story, we're wired for story. Our human brain is wired for story. The stories we have to tell are so crucial. I'll show you a couple of stories in a moment. And also the student's self-narrative. Who am I? What is my skill set? What do I have to offer others? Students often aren't very good at telling their story. Valuing reflection, making sense of personal experiences, integrating head and heart. These are the things that, as Dewey said, without reflection, you don't really get learning from experience. So we'll have a look at analytics around reflection. And student agency. If we are disempowering students with our learning at scale platforms, we've clearly lost the plot. And when we're trying to create citizens who have the confidence and skill set to go out and change how we're doing things, they need to be empowered. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So belonging, why do we care about belonging? A few headlines there. It's positively tied to transition into HE, persistence and graduation rates, academic performance, mental health and well-being. Lots of literature on that. It's an active field of research. If you don't feel safe, you can't learn. If you don't feel that you're valued, that's not a good learning situation. Belonging is often talked about, at least having two elements, a sense of valued engagement, a feeling of being valued and needed and accepted in this environment, and a sense of fit. But we don't want fit to turn into assimilation, right? If I'm in a minority group at a middle class or upper class white place, I don't necessarily want to fit by becoming like them. I want to know that I matter and my distinctive history and culture and worldview is important. Let me show you a couple of examples of belonging as told through stories. Great work at Georgetown University. Here's the story. There was only one other Latina in the classroom who I knew, and her name was common, Maria. Her name was pronounced. The academic is going around and saying hello to all the students and saying their names, because learning your names is important to me. So before he could even try, he looked at me, and all I did was say my name. I waited for him to attempt, but he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish," and moved on. Her name was quite a complicated one. Right? From then on, he never attempted once to pronounce my name. Every time I participated in class, he would just point at me. A story of alienation. But a story that Henry Giroux would be very happy about. Earlier this semester, I had the chance to attend IVG, the largest first-generation low-income student conference in the nation.
alongside 6 amazing other Hoyas. Throughout our time at the conference, being able to share my struggles and stresses and my triumphs and victories as a first-gen student of color with our delegation illuminated a new profound sense of solidarity. We continue to be fearless, apologetic, and determined. Georgetown is not Georgetown without its black, brown, low-income, first-gen, undocumented, queer, etc. student population. So there's a whole load of identity stuff going on here. I can be me. I'm proud to be me, and I'm here at Georgetown. So deal with it. Yeah, very nice attitude. Okay, so the hypothesis is that if we could develop track and possible to, we could develop valid indicators of sense of belonging longitudinally at scale in a timely manner, feeding it back to students and or staff, then belonging analytics could be a thing. All right, we're at an early stage. And in the paper and in the longer webinar on the website, we unpack the rationale in more detail. And we give a number of examples. So let me show you 4 examples of the kinds of platforms I'm talking about, just to give you a clue as to how we're thinking about this, right? So students are encouraged to share their story through this platform called SenseMaker, which some of you may know from Dave Snowden's interesting work around making sense of extreme complexity. You share your story, but then you're asked to index it, right? And you have this interesting triangle. And the prompt here, if there was support in my story, it came from Georgetown staff, Georgetown faculty, or my family. And your job is to drag the red dot to wherever you feel is the right place in the triangle. Okay. Was it just my family down here on the right? Was it sort of halfway between them? Was it bang in the middle here? Or was it actually nobody? Okay. If there was alienation in my story, it came from the staff, the faculty, or my family. Or if I felt discouraged to turn to my family, it was because they wouldn't understand. I feel responsible for handling this myself. I don't want to burden them. Okay, but what you can see here, of course, is we've moved now as we aggregate the data from individual very rich stories to statistics. We now have clusters in the triangles. So just a very neat trick to go from rich narrative to quant data. And the agency is with the storyteller, not some researcher deciding what your story's about. So a very nice move there as well. Okay, another example. We call this dispositional learning analytics. Again, this is not very high tech at all. There's a survey, a validated survey that's been developed over the last 20 years by my colleague Ruth Deacon-Crick, asking students how they approach their learning. And it's essentially, it's an index of their appetite for risk and uncertainty, their appetite to step out of their comfort zone. It generates a spider diagram. And a little slider at the top. And just to help you understand what these mean, here's an enlarged slide with the dimensions there and their opposites. So you get a sense of what kinds of qualities we're talking about here, all right? Agency versus being passive and mindless. A sense of hope and optimism about myself as a learner. That's not about the universe in general. It's about myself as a learner and that I'm developing and becoming a better learner. What sense of belonging do I have in terms of having people to turn to who I can talk to about my learning? To what extent am I closed and brittle, or fragile and independent, and dependent? So you can see dependence is coming up a couple of times. Being passive is coming up a couple of times there as well. All right. So these qualities that everybody has a list of 21st century skills, etc., etc. Many of these will resonate. Some of them are a little bit different. These are dispositions and they can be changed. This is not a personality diagnosis test that says, here's your Myers-Briggs type, deal with it, because you're essentially never going to change. This is meant to be very malleable. You get a personalized feedback report, which is driven by the data, which starts to give you clues about how you might work on, say, building a support belonging environment for yourself. And this is the structural equation model underpinning that survey. Just to flash that up to you, you can see the constructs are driving each other. Right in the middle there is mindful agency. Again, the details are all in that that paper there if you're curious to know. So another example, okay, this is student self-report data. The reason we can think of it as learning analytics is because you immediately get feedback. This isn't just a survey that researchers are conducting on you and you never find out what happens. And there's a lot of active scaffolding and support about how to put it into action. Okay, but nothing very advanced going on here technically. Example number 3 of 4. We are doing a lot to gather data from Canvas and other platforms, but rather than say, let's design a dashboard and hope the teachers can use it, the teachers are then saying, what would I do if I saw students who are or aren't engaging in certain kinds of activity and behavior? Because I've got things I want to say to them. Okay, so we have a data set of coming out of Canvas and out of any other platform, in fact, that you can either get an API to or get a CSV out of. There is a message editor which allows the educators to design the messages, they would say, right? I'm going to say something very different to you if you're completely disengaged than if you're just cruising and clearly, you know, doing amazing. I want to stretch you wherever you're at. Okay, and essentially this is mail merge, right? It's generating a tailored message. Each paragraph is inserted depending on the conditions of the rules. And then you get to preview the messages, and then, you know, maybe every Friday at 4 p.m. there might go a message out to hundreds of students at a time, potentially in a large first-year cohort, saying, you know, here's how you're going. I know how you're going. Number one, you are not just a faceless number, and I care how you're going, and this is what I want to say to you. All right, so they get an email from the instructor, from the academic. Doesn't matter about the details, but, you know, I'm going to say something to students who attended at least one class, saying, great. Very different to what I'm going to say to students who have yet to show up in the first 3 weeks. Okay, and what we are learning, and there's a paper there are many other papers, is that you can build a sense of belonging even during lockdown with students stuck in countries thousands of miles from Sydney. You can create that sense of belonging, that motivation. We're not just giving feedback on your cognitive mastery of the curriculum here. We are using, you know, all the best scholarship we know to create motivating messages that say, you know, I believe you can do better. This may not be the result you were after, but, you know, all is not lost. And there's a lot of human stuff going on here, right? It's written in the voice of the academic. And we have just published a paper looking at what it means to be skilled using these tools, because that's the next question there. This could be a weapon of mass destruction in the wrong hands, right? Give it to the professor you know who gives scathing feedback, and now she can send hundreds of scathing messages at the click of a button, right? It's not what we're after. So you need to learn how to be literate. You almost need a driving license for this tool, and essentially that's the training we take our staff on. Okay, final example: reflective writing. Here's an example that again it's just one of those moments that you dream of as an academic. Before I came to this class, in this case, I had never really thought much about gender and what it means, or that it's something that's fluid. Taking this course was completely eye-opening and really made me think about things I've never had the chance to think about. Awesome. Okay. Could a machine make sense of that? Because this is reflective writing. This is not writing an argument or a lit review or a lab report or a persuasive essay. This is me talking about myself, my experience, my emotions, how I'm changing. Well, we've been developing for the last few years what we believe to be the first reflective writing feedback tool. And there's lots of papers about this. You can follow one of those links here. But you can see what it's doing is it's annotating sentences that it recognizes as making critical moves in good reflective writing, where you talk about your thoughts and feelings about a significant experience, where you talk about something that was surprising or problematic, where you talk about how you're changing as a learner, where you talk about your feelings, where you talk about, you engage in self-critique, right? This is such a different form of writing from the essay where you're generally out to just demonstrate how clever you are, right? This is actually about exposing yourself and acknowledging that you're changing and that you're really screwed up on that work placement, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And we've found that in our research that students value this. They might have been skeptical at the beginning, but by the end they valued it. The academics are very happy with the scaffolding it's providing for the students. And this is totally connected to the assessment rubric and the activities they're being given. So, for example, if they're pharmacy students, this is a pharmacy student. Is this a pharmacy student?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. They've been in a pharmacy on work placement, and something happened. You know, they screwed up with a patient, or perhaps they did an awesome job, and they were so grateful that they had thought about something in advance. The academic has made it very clear why, as a reflective practitioner, you need to be able to make sense of your experience. Okay. If that work is not done around the technologies, the students are going, why am I being asked to use this? How does this relate to the assessment criteria? This just seems like a bolt-on, right? And there's no point. So we want to really integrate that into the learning design. Okay, so those are 4 examples of what we're thinking of as ways of thinking about belonging and analytics and how they can come into dialogue with each other. And I'm suggesting that that's an example out of my work where I'm thinking about these values around agency, story, imagination, emotion, reflection. And those are at least somewhat aligned with the kinds of critiques that Giroux and McGilchrist are making around the ways that we engage with the world and the ways that we use technology. So, to wrap up, I'm proposing that failure to learn is a meaningful diagnosis of our current condition, and we should have something to say about that. I've suggested that you might, or you might not, want to think about changing what you do. There are choices we can make about which projects we work on, which kinds of learning we focus on. We all still need to learn maths. We all still need to write. We all still need to learn history. We all still need to learn about the arts. So I'm not for a moment trying to sort of make some kind of league table. But there are certainly modes of thinking and problem solving that seem particularly germane right now. Complex systems thinking, understanding how to work across cultural boundaries, conflict resolution. You know, there's a long list of particular curricula we might want to focus on. But beyond that, there are dispositions, ways of being, your stance to the world. Dispositions are not a warm, fuzzy thing that no one can really get a grip on. There are ways of thinking about that rigorously, and you can cultivate that. I've been talking about designing sustainable socio-technical ecosystems that require trust, whether that's the level of a university and how we get the stuff we build out there in a way that's got integrity and we haven't blown the trust of our community, because as soon as that goes, then we're really stuck. And I've talked about, of course, the very much larger ecosystems that we're now wrestling with, and the level of trust and communication that's going to be needed, and the skill set and the dispositions needed to do that work that we face now is obviously huge. But I think we have a role to play. McGilchrist and Giroux are offering sharp diagnoses of our condition. They don't pull out their punches at all. They lay down the challenge for education and whether it is fulfilling the role that it should be playing in bringing the disciplines together, bringing different ways of thinking together, and actually creating people who will change society and not just feed business and government with the skill set it needs, because that might not be what we need to simply keep doing more of. And I put it to you that the Learning at Scale community has a critical role to play, and I'm very curious to know what you think about these ideas, and very happy to discuss with you here for the rest of the conference and beyond. So thanks very much.
I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Yes, Thomas?
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. And some things to think about. And what I was thinking about is in terms of learning analytics, which is an entire field that requires formative engagement from students in order to do anything. Students have to do certain kinds of sanctioned forms of engagement in order to register the data that then can be analytic.
Right. We can't read minds yet.
Right. But we also have to be incredibly reductive in terms of reading the engagement of students in order to produce this data. How does that square with, for instance, Giroux's perspective on a pedagogy, well, like it's really Frere's perspective on a pedagogy of the oppressed and the voices that are silenced? I'm thinking it's one thing to talk about engagement, but when you take it to belonging, how do you conceptualize belonging when you're building your understanding of belonging on a system that only legitimizes certain forms of performative engagement that then necessarily may silence certain voices?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm hoping that I've given you 4 examples of ways of getting data out of students, if we want to put it in a kind of, brutal way, right? By asking them questions, by getting them to reflect, by inviting them to tell their stories, right? Is inviting you to tell your story an oppressive act? I mean, yes, I as the instructor or as the architect of the student of the course, my responsibility is to create the opportunities for engagement. My hope is that it won't be oppressive, but I have to know what's going on in your head. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to do that. Now, you might find something that I ask you to do to be uncomfortable. That might or might not be good or not. Come to university, going to make you uncomfortable. That's okay, but safe, respectful, etc. So yes, we've got to get students to do things. Coming to university, you are joining an institution that does things. Many of us are frustrated at the ways our institutions do things and the things we make students do. Many of us right now are busy trying to figure out how we're going to evolve our assessments to be much more engaging and authentic than what they have been because of the threat of generative AI, etc. So yes, we have to make students do things, but there must be ways of doing that is not oppressive.
Absolutely. Now, I didn't mean to go into that it was oppressive. I just meant that. So, for instance, when you take those stories and make those triangles,
yeah,
the students just didn't decide what those. The students just didn't decide the questions.
Very good. Yeah,
they gave you answers, and that's a long form. But then they didn't decide the poles on those triangles.
I don't believe in that Georgetown study they did, but there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't go through a participatory design process to discuss what we thought the most important poles should be.
Okay, we have 3 hands, I think.
Yeah.
Sasha first. And just a quick follow-up on what has been just articulated. Do you think it's worth turning those voices and narratives into data? And if yes, for whom? Because that's the premise, right? We're building analytics based on these voices. So that's...
Well, yes, I do think it's useful because talking and writing helps us think. Talking and writing helps others see what's going on in our minds. Talking and writing clarifies our own sense making of our experience. The question of who gets to see the data is a good one. Like, is it only the research team and the authorities who get to see those cluster analyses? It depends on the way you've set it up. There's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't want to turn back the aggregate data and have a really interesting conversation with the students about that, because it could be safe, because those are de-identified data points in the triangles, if we take that example. Or if we were to do text analysis on the reflections, we might have some aggregated cohort text analytics that could be an interesting provocation for discussion. So there are a lot of orchestration decisions here that I think can be made that are, that vary how much participation and empowerment we give the student.
Okay, and 2 questions and then lunch. So, sorry, I don't know the name, but...
Sure, thank you, Simon. The question take us in a slightly different direction. I work with national ministries of education policymakers. They're dealing with often fear-based decision-making driven by election cycles, short-termism, economic concerns, etc. What's your wisdom on the best ways to get this humanizing vision of the future of AI in education into government decision-making?
Oh, that sounds easy. Yeah, look, anyone who's working with departments of education knows the constraints they're under. Yeah, look, I mean, where do we start with our dysfunctional educational policy making? I mean, I talked about how we're failing to raise the leaders up who can speak to this, but I mean, there are many people who are saying these kinds of things, who are forging those partnerships with more progressive departments of education. I can think about some in Australia who are calling for the change to the high-stakes high school exam system, who are pioneering and prototyping what it means to come into university with a portfolio that evidences your work rather than sitting exams and just coming out with some grade numbers that really don't mean very much. Employers are now complaining that graduates don't have the competencies that they need. You know, I've already critiqued that because our job as universities is not simply to feed business and industry the skills and graduates they need. That's important for sure, but it's not the only thing. So yeah, look, let's have lunch and we'll solve it by.
Okay, and the last question maybe you had, right? Yeah.
So it may well be true in Australia as well. For us, a large fraction of the students that perhaps we don't enable to belong are those for whom English is not their first language. And so I wondered how you think, so reflective writing would be a real challenge because even just technical writing is already, so expressing emotions in a secondary language at an early point when we really want to enable that belonging is a problem.
Yes.
So I wondered how you would enable that and whether we should be thinking about the opportunity to write this in a first language.
Yes. So we haven't run into major problems either pedagogically or technically with English as second language students doing reflective writing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, reflective writing is quite personal. Writing in your first language and having it translated might well be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Now we have generative AI. Generative AI could be used to polish up your English. I think we might be moving into a state where your first language is just an irrelevance. Now that language technology has moved so fast and so far, it could be that first language is now an irrelevance. And what we care about is your ideas, your expression, your ability to think on your feet, defend and explain your work. And we're going to worry less and less about what percentage of the text on that page did you write versus co-write with an AI. So I didn't even talk about Gen AI in this talk, but I'm very happy to over lunch or later. It's been consuming my life for the last 6 months. But yeah, so why not write in Chinese, have it translated, have ChatGPT then turn it actually into better reflective writing. But let's also make sure that we create the opportunities in our assessment practices where you have to actually defend that work as well, because we better know that you understand what you wrote. And that's all part of the transition to new forms and paradigms for assessment in the age of AI.
Okay.
But yeah, great question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're back at 1 o'clock, so.